On a warm summer night in 1955, in the quiet little town of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, a group of ordinary families found themselves in the middle of one of the most terrifying and bizarre events in American history. It was supposed to be just another Sunday night at the Sutton farmhouse, where relatives, friends, and neighbors gathered for dinner and conversation. But instead, what happened that evening would become known as the Hopkinsville Goblin Encounter, a night of fear, gunfire, and strange beings that no one could ever truly explain. At first glance, Hopkinsville was nothing special, a small farming community surrounded by fields, woods, and the occasional barn. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where the nights were quiet, and the stars in the sky were so bright you could see the Milky Way stretching overhead. People lived simple lives, working hard during the day and enjoying calm evenings with their families. No one could have imagined that something strange, something otherworldly, would ever disturb the peace. But on this particular night, peace was broken. It started with a strange light in the sky. Some of the witnesses described it as a glowing object, streaking across the horizon before dipping down into the nearby woods. Others said it looked like a meteor or a bright fireball. Whatever it was, it caught their attention and left them uneasy. At the time, no one could have guessed that this glowing object might have been connected to the terrifying events that followed. The Sutton farmhouse that evening was crowded. Inside were two families, the Suttons and the Taylors, along with a few children. The home was full of chatter, laughter, and the sounds of plates and silverware clinking together. But soon, those warm family sounds would be replaced by gunfire, screams, and whispered prayers. Around 7 p.m., one of the men stepped outside and spotted something unusual near the tree line. At first, he thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or an owl. But as he looked closer, his blood ran cold. The figure was small, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, with a round, oversized head, long arms that seemed to reach the ground, and glowing yellow eyes that shone even in the darkness. Its movements were jerky, almost unnatural, as if it didn't belong to this world. The man called for the others. Soon, several family members crowded by the window, watching in disbelief. This wasn't an ordinary animal. This was something different, something they had never seen before. The creature slowly crept closer to the house, moving through the tall grass, as if it was testing, watching, studying them. The families panicked. They rushed to lock the doors and shutter the windows. In the 1950s, in rural Kentucky, people didn't call the police at the first sign of trouble. They grabbed their guns. Inside the farmhouse, shotguns and rifles were pulled out and loaded. The men stood guard while the women gathered the children and tried to keep them calm. Then the real nightmare began. From the darkness, more figures appeared, not just one but several small creatures with glowing eyes, pointed ears, and long fingers that seemed to scrape against the windows. The family could hear scratching on the walls, footsteps on the roof, and the sound of something brushing against the doors. The first shot rang out. A loud blast shattered the silence of the night as one of the men fired at a creature perched near a window. The figure fell backward, tumbling into the yard, but to their horror, it didn't stay down. The creature rose again, seemingly unharmed, and scurried into the shadows. That was only the beginning. For hours, the Sutton farmhouse became the site of a siege. The creatures circled the home, peering through windows, climbing onto the roof, and darting back into the woods whenever shots were fired. The families inside were terrified, firing at anything that moved, praying that the night would end. But no matter how many times the goblin-like beings were shot, they never seemed to stay down. They would fall, float, or glide to the ground, then stand back up and continue their eerie attack. The children cried. The women huddled together, whispering prayers. The men sweated nervously as they reloaded their weapons, their fingers shaking on the triggers. Every shadow outside the window looked like glowing eyes. Every creak of the old farmhouse sounded like claws scratching closer. The hours dragged on, and the fear only grew stronger. No one knew what these beings were. Were they goblins, as the family later described them? Were they aliens from another world, connected to the glowing object seen in the sky earlier that evening? Or were they something else entirely, something beyond human understanding? By the time midnight struck, the Sutton family was exhausted, terrified, and desperate. They decided to make a run for help. Gathering the children, they raced out of the house and into their cars, speeding toward the Hopkinsville police station. When they arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, they told officers an unbelievable story. Their home had been under attack for hours by small goblin-like creatures. At first, the police didn't know what to think, but the families were so shaken, so terrified, that officers agreed to check it out. When they returned to the farmhouse, what they found shocked them. Bullet holes riddled the walls and windows. Shell casings were scattered across the floor. And while there were no bodies or creatures left behind, the officers themselves reported strange glowing lights in the distance and an eerie feeling they couldn't explain. Something had happened that night, something the police couldn't easily dismiss. And this was only the beginning of what would become one of America's most famous and chilling encounters with the unknown. To really understand the Hopkinsville Goblin encounter, we need to step back in time and place ourselves in the small Kentucky farming community of 1955. Life there was simple, quiet, and rural. Most families owned small farms, raising crops or animals, and neighbors often lived miles apart. Nights in Hopkinsville were especially still. You could hear the crickets, the wind moving through the trees, and not much else. It was the kind of quiet that could make even small noises seem louder, sharper, and more unnerving. The farmhouse where the event unfolded belonged to the Sutton family. It wasn't a large or fancy home, but it was sturdy, with wooden walls, a few small windows, and a tin roof. It sat on open farmland, surrounded by fields and patches of dark forest. To the Suttons, it was home, safe, familiar, and ordinary. Nobody would have expected that it would soon become the stage for a terrifying and mysterious night. That Sunday evening, the house was more crowded than usual. The Suttons were hosting family and friends, including the Taylor family, who had come over for dinner and to spend some time together. In all, there were around 11 people in the home that night, men, women, and children. It was the kind of gathering that was common in rural communities. After long days of work in the fields or at jobs in town, people would come together to eat, talk, and enjoy each other's company. The children played in the corners, their laughter filling the room. The women worked in the kitchen, preparing simple but hearty meals, while the men sat on the porch, smoking, drinking, and swapping stories. It was a normal, happy family scene, completely ordinary. But outside the farmhouse, the Kentucky night was growing darker. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, shadows stretched across the fields. The woods nearby became thick with darkness, and the stars above shone brilliantly in the sky. Unlike in cities, where lights drown out the heavens, here the stars were clear and bright, almost close enough to touch. For many families in Hopkinsville, nights under the stars were a peaceful time. But on this particular evening, the beauty of the night sky carried something more ominous. One of the Taylor men stepped outside around dusk to fetch water from the pump. As he looked up at the sky, he noticed something strange, a glowing object streaking overhead. Some later described it as a bright light or a fireball, moving quickly before dipping low and disappearing beyond the tree line. At the time, he thought it might have been a meteor, and he didn't make much of it. But this was the first sign that something unusual was about to unfold. Inside the farmhouse, the group carried on with their evening, the chatter of voices mixed with the clinking of dishes. Nobody realized that they were being watched from the darkness outside. The setting made what happened next even scarier. In a city, strange noises or sights can often be explained away, traffic, lights, or neighbors nearby. But in rural Hopkinsville, there were no streetlights, no cars passing by, no background noise to disguise what was coming. Every sound carried, every shadow meant something. When things turned strange, there was no one else for miles to run to for immediate help. The house itself became a character in the story. Its wooden walls, thin windows, and tin roof, which had once felt like protection, now seemed fragile. Every knock on the wall, every creak of the floorboards seemed magnified. Imagine being inside that house, knowing that outside in the darkness, something was moving, watching, and creeping closer. Even the family dog sensed something was wrong. Reports say it barked furiously, then whimpered, and eventually hid itself under the house, refusing to come back out. Animals often sense danger before humans do, and this was no exception. The families were used to the sounds of the woods. owls hooting, coyotes calling, or the rustle of raccoons in the brush. But what they would soon face was nothing like the normal wildlife of Kentucky. The setting, an isolated farmhouse, deep in rural America far from help, created the perfect atmosphere for fear. It was here, in this quiet, dark, and lonely landscape, that the Suttons and Taylors would face something that defied explanation. The Hopkinsville Goblin encounter wasn't just a story about strange creatures. It was a story about where it happened. A simple home filled with ordinary people suddenly thrust into an extraordinary nightmare. That farmhouse, those fields, and those woods would forever be remembered, not as a peaceful Kentucky setting, but as the site of one of the strangest and most frightening encounters in history. And with the scene set, the night was only beginning. Strange lights had been spotted. The dog was restless. The children were starting to sense that something wasn't quite right. Soon the ordinary gathering would explode into chaos. The farmhouse would no longer feel safe, and the families inside would come face to face with something beyond their understanding. As the night deepened over Hopkinsville, the Sutton farmhouse should have been settling into calm and quiet. Inside, laughter and conversation carried on, but outside something unusual was stirring in the darkness. The first strange sign had already appeared. The bright glowing object that one of the Taylors saw streaking across the sky. To him, it had looked like a meteor, but meteors don't usually dip low and vanish near the treetops. Still, nobody gave it much thought at the time. Strange lights in the sky were curious, but not terrifying. That would soon change. Not long after, around 8 p.m., Billy Ray Taylor stepped outside to draw water from the backyard. Well, the summer air was heavy with the scent of grass and soil, and the fields were quiet, aside from the chirping of crickets. As he looked up, his attention was drawn once again to the sky. This time, he saw something far stranger than a meteor. Billy Ray later described it as a large, glowing object, oval in shape, moving silently overhead. It wasn't flying like a plane, and it wasn't falling like a rock. It hovered, then dipped low, gliding without a sound, before disappearing into the trees at the edge of the farm. He was shocked, startled enough that he ran back into the house, blurting out what he had seen. The others laughed at first, brushing it off. They teased him, saying he had probably seen a shooting star, or that his imagination was running wild. After all, they had been relaxing, telling stories, and it wasn't unusual for someone to exaggerate for attention. But Billy Ray was insistent. He swore up and down that he had seen something real, and he didn't find it funny. His seriousness caught the attention of a few of the men, but most of the group continued on as if nothing was wrong. That changed when the family's dog began to act strangely. The animal barked furiously toward the woods, its hackles raised. Then suddenly, it stopped, whimpered, and bolted under the house, refusing to come out. This was unusual. Farm dogs were used to wildlife, foxes, coyotes, even snakes. But whatever it sensed this time was different. Its fear was contagious, sending a ripple of unease through the group. The men exchanged uneasy looks, and curiosity began to outweigh their skepticism, deciding they needed to check things out. Billy Ray Taylor and Lucky Sutton armed themselves with shotguns and stepped outside. The others remained inside, peering nervously through the windows. At first, all they saw was darkness. The night was heavy, thick, and quiet. Too quiet. The usual sounds of the countryside seemed to have faded away. No owls, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls. It was as if the world had gone silent, holding its breath. And then they saw it. From the edge of the trees came a faint glow, almost like a soft shimmer of light. At first they thought it might be a lantern, or maybe reflections from car headlights far off in the distance. But then the glow took shape. A small figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly toward the house. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The creature stood about 3 to 4 feet tall, with a round, oversized head that nearly doubled the size of its thin body. Its arms were unnaturally long, stretching down almost to its knees, and its hands appeared to end in long, claw-like fingers. The most terrifying feature, however, were its eyes. They were large, round, and glowing, shining brightly in the darkness like 2 eerie lanterns. The figure moved in a strange, jerky manner, almost as if it were floating just above the ground. Its legs didn't stride like a human's. They seemed weak, barely used. Instead, the arms moved and stretched out as if they helped guide its balance. Billy Ray and Lucky froze, their shotguns raised, but their minds racing. They couldn't process what they were seeing. This wasn't a person, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely. Trying to steady his nerves, Lucky shouted toward the figure, demanding to know who or what it was. There was no response. The glowing-eyed creature kept moving closer. When it reached the edge of the clearing near the house, it raised its long arms as if reaching out. That was enough to break their shock. The men fired. The blast from the shotguns shattered the silence of the Kentucky night. The creature fell backward, tumbling into the darkness. For a moment, they thought it was over, that whatever it had been was now gone. But seconds later, the glow returned. The same figure, or perhaps another like it, appeared again, unharmed, moving closer. Panic spread. They fired again and again, but each time, the creatures seemed unaffected. The gunshots lit up the night, and the sounds drew the rest of the family into full-blown terror. The women pulled the children to the back of the house, while the men shouted and scrambled to reload. As if answering the gunfire, more figures appeared. From the shadows of the trees, glowing eyes began to multiply. One, then two, then several small goblin-like creatures surrounded the farmhouse. They moved slowly, deliberately, with those long arms stretching forward as if to grab or claw at the walls and windows. The family was under siege. From the moment Billy Ray saw that glowing object in the sky, the night had shifted from ordinary to unimaginable. What had begun as a quiet evening with family and friends was now turning into a nightmare. Strange lights, glowing-eyed figures, gunfire that had no effect. Every sign pointed to something unnatural, something far beyond the Suttons' understanding. And this was just the beginning. The creatures were circling, the family was trapped inside, and the farmhouse, once a symbol of safety and comfort, was about to become a battleground. The first sight of those glowing-eyed figures was terrifying enough, but what came next would shake the Sutton and Taylor families to their core. The quiet Kentucky farmhouse, once a place of warmth and laughter, was about to become the scene of one of the strangest and most chilling battles ever recorded in American folklore. After the first gunshots rang out, the men inside the house thought the danger might be over. The creature had fallen back into the dark, and for a moment, the night was silent again. But that silence did not last. Soon, glowing lights, those eerie, oversized eyes, reappeared from the shadows. Not just one, but several. The creatures were back. From the edge of the trees, they crept closer, circling the farmhouse like predators closing in on their prey. Their movements were slow but steady, and each step seemed deliberate, as if they had no fear of the humans or their weapons. Inside, panic broke out. The women screamed, the children cried, and the men shouted over each other, trying to decide what to do. The farmhouse was small, its wooden walls thin. It was no fortress. If these beings wanted to break in, could the family really stop them? Billy Ray and Lucky rushed to the windows, their shotguns ready. Suddenly, one of the glowing-eyed creatures appeared right outside the glass, peering in. Its claw-like hand reached up toward the window frame as if it were about to climb inside. Without hesitation, Lucky fired. The shotgun blast shattered the window, sending glass flying. The figure fell back, but again, it didn't stay down. It simply disappeared into the dark. The gunfire drew others. From the roof came a thumping sound. The family froze as they realized one of the creatures had climbed onto the tin roof of the house. Its long fingers scratched and scraped, sending shivers through everyone inside. The metallic thuds echoed like drumbeats of terror. Another creature was spotted crouching near the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on the entrance as if waiting for someone to step outside. Billy Ray swung the door open and fired, the blast lighting up the porch. Once again, the figure seemed to tumble backward, only to get back up and vanish into the shadows. The family quickly realized something horrifying. The creatures could not be killed. Shotguns and rifles had little effect. It was as if the beings absorbed the bullets or were somehow shielded from harm. No matter how many times the family fired, the goblins kept coming back, persistent and fearless. The battle stretched on. For nearly 4 hours, the family defended their home. Every time one of the creatures approached the windows or doors, a shotgun blast would follow. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder, smoke, and fear. The children cried in the back rooms, the women prayed, and the men shouted warnings as glowing figures moved around the house. At one point, one of the creatures was seen hanging from the edge of the roof, its clawed hands gripping the gutters, its head tilted, eyes glowing, as it stared down into the windows. Another was spotted crouching near the back door, arms raised as though trying to pry its way inside. The men fired again and again, desperate to keep them at bay. But the strangest part was how the creatures moved. They didn't run, they didn't charge. Instead, they glided, floated, or jerked in unnatural ways, almost as if gravity worked differently for them. They seemed to appear and disappear at will, retreating into the woods only to return moments later from another angle. Hours dragged on like a nightmare that would not end. The family was exhausted, terrified, and nearly out of ammunition. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound of scratching on the roof kept their nerves on edge. It felt as though they were trapped in a cage, surrounded by something alien and unstoppable. Finally, sometime after midnight, the activity seemed to lessen. The creatures withdrew, fading back into the darkness of the fields and woods. For the first time in hours, the farmhouse fell silent. But silence did not mean safety. The family didn't dare believe it was over. They remained huddled together, wide-eyed and trembling, listening for any sign of movement outside. Every shadow seemed alive. Every sound of the wind in the trees made their hearts race. The longest night of their lives stretched into the early hours of the morning. The men kept their guns close, while the women held the children tight. Sleep was impossible. Fear kept them awake, alert, and waiting for the next knock on the wall or scratch on the roof. The farmhouse, once a home of comfort, was now scarred with broken windows, bullet holes, and shattered nerves. The Suttons and Taylors had defended themselves the best they could, but what exactly had they fought off? The creatures hadn't seemed injured. They hadn't acted like animals. They had behaved with purpose, intelligence, and a strange kind of persistence. When the sun finally began to rise over Hopkinsville, relief washed over the family. The night was over. But the fear remained. Had the goblins gone for good, or were they still watching, hiding in the trees, waiting for nightfall to return? The Sutton family didn't wait to find out. With the first light of dawn, they made a decision that would change the course of the story forever. They needed help. They needed answers. And there was only one place to go: the police. The gunfire had quieted. The scratching on the roof was gone. The glowing eyes outside the windows had faded back into the trees. For the first time in hours, the Sutton farmhouse was silent. But silence didn't mean safety. Inside, the family sat frozen in fear. The children clung to their mothers, still trembling and wide-eyed. The men sat gripping their guns tightly, their eyes darting to the windows and doors, ready for the creatures to return at any moment. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, mixing with sweat and fear. No one spoke much. When they did, their voices were hushed, almost whispers, as if speaking too loudly might draw the goblins back. Every ear strained for sounds outside. Was that the wind in the trees, or footsteps in the grass? Was that the creak of the house settling, or claws on the roof again? The dog, which had fled under the house earlier, refused to come out. Its silence was unnerving. Farm dogs usually barked at strangers, at coyotes, at raccoons, but not tonight. Tonight, even the dog seemed too frightened to make a sound. Time moved painfully slowly. Minutes felt like hours. Each tick of the clock hammered into their nerves. The men checked and rechecked their guns, though the truth weighed heavily on them. They had already learned that bullets didn't stop these creatures. Still, holding a weapon was the only small comfort they had left. The children, though exhausted, couldn't sleep. Some cried quietly, while others sat wide-eyed, asking their mothers if the goblins were going to come back. The women had no answers. They could only hold their children and whisper that everything would be all right, even though they weren't sure it was true. Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray sat near the windows, their eyes scanning the dark fields outside. Each time the wind shifted and grass rustled, their fingers twitched on the triggers. but the goblins didn't return. It was almost worse than the attack itself. The waiting, the uncertainty, the fear of not knowing where the creatures had gone. At one point, Lucky thought he saw movement near the barn. He raised his gun, heart pounding, only to realize it was just shadows moving in the moonlight, but his nerves were shot. His hands shook as he lowered the weapon. He wasn't alone. Everyone inside was on edge, and no one dared to relax. The farmhouse, once a warm gathering place, now felt like a trap. Broken glass littered the floors from the shattered windows. Bullet holes scarred the wooden walls. The tin roof carried dents and scratches from where the creatures had landed. It was as if the house itself had been wounded by the night's battle. And still, the fear lingered. Some of the family members whispered prayers. Others sat in silence, staring blankly at the walls as if trying to convince themselves it had all been a nightmare. But deep down, they all knew it had been real. They had seen the glowing eyes. They had watched the creatures move across their yard, crawl onto their roof, and peer into their windows. They had fired round after round and achieved nothing. The hours stretched on. Midnight turned into 1 o'clock, then 2, then 3. Every time someone thought about stepping outside to check the yard, the thought of those glowing eyes stopped them. No one dared to open a door again. It wasn't until the first faint glow of dawn crept over the horizon that the atmosphere inside the house began to shift. The rising sun brought with it a fragile sense of relief. The fields outside were no longer shrouded in darkness. The shadows pulled back. The woods were no longer an endless wall of black. And yet, as the light grew, the farmhouse looked like the aftermath of a war. Windows were shattered. Bullet casings were scattered across the floor. Furniture had been overturned in panic. Everyone's faces were pale, hollow, and exhausted. No one had slept. No one had even closed their eyes. It was Lucky Sutton who finally broke the silence. "We can stay here," he muttered. "Not after what happened." The others nodded. They knew he was right. Whatever those creatures had been, whatever they wanted, the family couldn't risk facing them again alone. The men agreed. They needed help. They needed someone with authority, with weapons, maybe even with answers. There was only one place to turn: the police. Gathering their strength, the family prepared to leave the house. The children were bundled together, the women still whispering comfort to them. The men clutched their guns tightly, still half expecting the creatures to reappear as soon as they opened the door. But when they stepped outside, the morning sun revealed only silence. The yard looked normal, too normal. There were no bodies, no tracks, no evidence of the creatures they had fought all night. It was as if the goblins had melted back into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but terror. Still, the fear was real, and the damage to the house was proof that something had happened. Bullet holes, shattered glass, and terrified witnesses. Those were things the police couldn't ignore. With trembling voices and tired eyes, the Sutton and Taylor families climbed into their vehicles and drove into town. They were leaving behind a night of horror, but they were not leaving it behind completely. The fear rode with them. The memory of glowing eyes and clawed hands was burned into their minds. The long night was finally over, but the story of the Hopkinsville Goblins was only just beginning. When the Suttons and Taylors arrived in Hopkinsville early that Monday morning, they were a sight no one could ignore. They looked pale, shaken, and exhausted. Some of the children were crying, clinging tightly to their mothers. The men carried their shotguns, not to threaten anyone, but because they refused to let go of them after what they had faced. Their story poured out quickly: glowing-eyed creatures, clawed hands, scratching on the roof, and a farmhouse under siege for hours. At first, the police didn't know what to think. Hopkinsville was a small town, and wild stories like this didn't usually walk through the station doors. The families insisted that they had been attacked, that their lives had been in danger. They weren't drunk, they weren't laughing, and they weren't telling a tall tale for fun. They were dead serious, and they were terrified. The size of the group also mattered. It wasn't just one person claiming to have seen something strange. It was men, women, and children. Over 10 people, all saying the same thing. Whatever had happened at that farmhouse, it had left them all deeply shaken. The police decided they couldn't ignore it. By mid-morning, a convoy of law enforcement and military personnel headed out to the Sutton farmhouse. It wasn't just a couple of local officers. Reports say there were 4 city police officers, 5 state troopers, military police from nearby Fort Campbell, and even reporters who caught wind of the bizarre story. The quiet Sutton farm suddenly became the center of a strange investigation. When the group arrived at the farmhouse, the first thing they noticed was the damage. The story might have sounded wild, but the evidence was hard to ignore. Windows were shattered, their frames blown apart by shotgun blasts, bullet holes riddled the walls and doorways, empty shell casings littered the floor and porch. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the air. Something had clearly happened. The officers carefully examined the scene, noting how much ammunition had been used. They interviewed each family member separately, checking for inconsistencies in their stories. But the accounts all matched. Each person, young and old, described the creatures in almost the exact same way: small, about 3 to 4 feet tall, with oversized round heads, long thin arms, glowing yellowish eyes, and strange claw-like hands. They all described the eerie floating movement, the scratching on the roof, and how the creatures seemed unaffected by bullets. Skeptics among the officers tried to find logical explanations. Maybe the family had mistaken owls for monsters. Great horned owls had glowing eyes when caught in the light, after all. But even that didn't explain everything. Owls didn't scratch roofs in groups. Owls didn't walk up to windows and stare inside. And owls certainly didn't shrug off shotgun blasts at close range. Others suggested the family had been drinking, but that theory didn't hold up either. None of the officers smelled alcohol, and several of the witnesses were children. Could a group that large really share the same wild hallucination? Unlikely. The investigators spread out, searching the yard, the fields, and the woods surrounding the farmhouse. They looked for footprints, blood, or any sign of the creatures. And though no bodies or tracks were found, some strange evidence did emerge. Witnesses reported that the officers saw an odd shimmering substance on the ground near where one of the creatures had supposedly fallen after being shot. Some described it as a silvery or metallic film that seemed to glow faintly before it evaporated. The police also noted how unnaturally tense the family's animals were. The dog, which had hidden under the house all night, refused to come out even in daylight. The farm animals seemed restless and spooked. By the time the investigation wrapped up, the police were left puzzled. There was no evidence of a hoax, but there was also no hard proof of strange creatures. All they had were terrified witnesses, bullet holes, shattered glass, and a story that defied explanation. The officers left by mid-afternoon, shaking their heads. Some thought the family might have seen something explainable, but exaggerated it out of fear. Others weren't so sure. Too many people had told the same story, and the fear in their eyes was impossible to fake. But for the Sutton and Taylor families, the ordeal wasn't over. That night, as the sun went down and the shadows stretched across the farm once more, the fear returned. The children clung to their mothers, and the men kept their guns close. They didn't know if the creatures would come back. They didn't know if the nightmare was truly over. Some reports even claimed that later that evening, the goblins returned briefly, showing themselves once more near the tree line as darkness fell. The family, still armed and terrified, fired again, though by now their nerves were shattered. Thankfully, this second night didn't last long, and by dawn, the beings were gone for good. The Hopkinsville police closed their official involvement soon after. There were no arrests, no reports of fraud, and no further investigation. But for the Sutton family, life would never return to normal. They had lived through something extraordinary, something they couldn't explain, and something they would never forget. The world, however, was done with them. News of the strange encounter was already spreading beyond Hopkinsville, and soon reporters, scientists, and skeptics from across the country would arrive, desperate to hear about the Hopkinsville Goblins. What had begun as a terrifying night for one family was about to become one of the most famous and debated encounters in UFO history. When the sun rose after that terrifying weekend, the Sutton farmhouse was no longer just a quiet family home. It had become the center of a mystery that reached far beyond the small town of Hopkinsville. At first, the Suttons thought the nightmare might fade away with the night. They hoped that once the police had investigated and the creatures seemed to be gone, they could return to their lives. But the truth was very different. News of the little men spread like wildfire, and by the following day, reporters, neighbors, and curious strangers were crowding the family's property. The Sutton farm quickly turned into something the family never wanted. A public spectacle. People arrived in cars and trucks, standing by the fence, staring at the house, and pointing toward the windows where the creatures had supposedly appeared. Some shouted questions at the family. Others simply wanted to get a glimpse of the alien attack site. Reporters came armed with notebooks and cameras. They snapped pictures of the house, the broken windows, the bullet holes, and the weary, pale faces of the Suttons and Taylors. Headlines appeared in local papers almost immediately. Strange visitors attack farm family. Hopkinsville besieged by little men. Space creatures invade Kentucky. For the Suttons, who were simple, hard-working farm people, this sudden attention was overwhelming. They weren't looking for fame, and they certainly weren't hoping to profit from their story. In fact, the more questions people asked, the more frustrated they became. They had told their truth, and yet people still doubted them. The townsfolk were divided. Some believed the Suttons completely, pointing to the consistency of their story, the number of witnesses, and their obvious fear. Others mocked them, calling the tale a hoax or a misunderstanding. Some even accused the family of making it up for attention, though the Suttons insisted that wasn't true. As the story spread beyond Kentucky, bigger newspapers and magazines picked it up. Suddenly, the Hopkinsville case was no longer just a local curiosity. It was a national phenomenon. UFO enthusiasts latched onto the story, claiming it was undeniable proof that aliens had visited Earth. Skeptics, on the other hand, wrote columns trying to explain the events as misidentified owls, meteor activity, or even mass hysteria. Radio shows began talking about it. Listeners across the country debated, were the Suttons honest witnesses of something unknown, or had they simply imagined the entire night? For the family, this media frenzy became almost as stressful as the encounter itself. They couldn't step outside without being hounded by questions. Some people came to the farm, not to ask questions but to make fun of them, calling them names or sneering at the idea of goblins in Kentucky. The children, who had been terrified that night, were now teased and whispered about by strangers. Their once simple lives were turned upside down. Despite all this, the family never changed their story. They repeated the same details over and over, never wavering, never contradicting themselves. This consistency only added weight to their claims. If it had been a prank, surely someone in the group would have slipped up under so much pressure, but that never happened. Meanwhile, UFO researchers and investigators began arriving in Hopkinsville. Some saw the case as one of the most important events in UFO history. They interviewed the family, examined the farmhouse, and compared the sightings to other reports of mysterious beings across the world. Theories began to form. Some suggested the beings were extraterrestrials, creatures from another world who had landed near the Sutton farm, perhaps by accident. Others thought the creatures might not have been aliens at all, but some kind of unknown species living on Earth, hidden from human eyes until that night. Skeptics clung to their own explanations. One of the most popular theories was that the Suttons had seen great horned owls whose glowing eyes and silent flight might have spooked them, but the family dismissed this immediately. Owls didn't scratch at doors, hover above the ground, or survive being shot point blank with shotguns. Some scientists suggested mass hysteria, that once one person believed they had seen something strange, the fear spread to the others, creating a shared illusion. But again, this theory didn't convince everyone. How could 11 people, including children, all share the exact same detailed hallucination? As the debates continued, the Suttons grew more tired of the attention. They hadn't asked for any of this, and they certainly weren't making money from it. In fact, some family members grew so annoyed with the constant visitors that they began charging a small fee for reporters to come onto their property, simply to keep strangers from trampling all over their land for free. This decision, however, led some critics to accuse them of fabricating the story for profit. But those who met the Suttons in person often left with a different impression. Reporters described them as plain, sincere country folk who seemed genuinely shaken by what had happened. Their fear wasn't the kind that could be faked for attention. It was deep, raw, and lasting. The Hopkinsville Goblins, as the creatures became known in newspapers, had officially entered American folklore. Whether you believed the story or not, it was impossible to ignore. By the end of the 1950s, the event had been written about in dozens of papers, studied by UFO groups, and debated in households across the nation. The Suttons, however, never enjoyed their unwanted fame. They grew weary of retelling the story, and in later years, some family members refused to speak about it at all. The more attention they received, the more they wished the entire ordeal had never happened. But the story refused to die. In fact, as time passed, the legend of the Hopkinsville Goblins only grew stronger. Books, articles, and documentaries would revisit the case again and again, each time asking the same question: what really happened that night in Kentucky? The Sutton family never got a clear answer. They only knew what they had seen, what they had endured, and how it had changed their lives forever. And as the years went on, the little town of Hopkinsville would become forever tied to the mystery, its name etched into UFO history as the site of one of the strangest and most famous encounters of all time.